G'day guys, and today I want to talk about birth rates in relation to the free market. Now, if you may recall, a few years back, before the migrant crisis in Europe, there was a bit of talk about how there wasn't enough people within Europe and essentially the economy was going to collapse and these countries were going to recede because as the baby boomers get older and retire, and as the younger generations come of age, there is this huge gap, this drop off in population, and I guess people were worrying that countries were going to recede in some capacity because they just didn't have enough population. But this is also happening at the same time where people say, oh, there's too many people, stop having children, save the planet and that sort of stuff. And it's kind of strange how they're importing all these people into first world countries, which of course consume far more resources than they would in third world countries, whilst at the same time worrying about the planet. But that's just the contradictory nature of propaganda, I suppose. So in this video, I'd like to attempt to extrapolate what would happen if essentially the European population was not fucked with in regards with immigration and borders and that sort of thing, and things were just left to their own devices. Now, I'm not an expert in culture and politics and sort of wide impacting things like this. I just have my own little bit of research I've done in my own noggin. But let's have a look at a supply and demand curve and think about what would happen when essentially the baby boomers come of age and start to die off. Well, if you think about housing, that's a big problem in Australia because right now there's a bit of a glut in house prices at the moment. They're starting to fall. But what was happening for many, many years is that the house prices in Australia just kept going up and up and up and up and up. I believe the median house price in Sydney is over $1 million. Because essentially what was happening is the demand for housing was increasing with increased immigration. More and more people were coming into the country and competing economically for those cheaper houses. Well, that means anyone who is going to buy one of those houses now has to move either into a shittier house, they have to move out into the country, or they have to buy up a more expensive house. Native inhabitants were essentially being pushed higher into the property game, so to speak. So people, because of the increased competition, were pretty desperate for a house. They really, really wanted to get a house. So if we look at our supply and demand curve, we can essentially say that the demand for houses increased. So if we move that purple line upwards, we can also see that it would correlate to an increase in price. So mass immigration into Australia is promoting this increased house prices. But if you think about it, we should be going through a massive drop in house prices at the moment, because what we essentially have is this massive generation, a very populous generation, I believe the biggest generation in history, known as the baby boomers, and they're starting to die off right now, and we have much smaller generations like the millennials, the Gen X, the Gen Z, coming of age and starting to get into the property market, and those generations are a lot smaller than the baby boomers, so in effect there should be less demand for houses. So we take that purple line and we move it down towards the meeting of the price and the quantity axis. Well, if there's less demand for a product and people just don't care about it so much, so to speak, well, the price is going to go down. Let's think about a couple of different laptops. I'm looking at one right now. See, my laptop, it's very old. It's a Core i3. It has really shitty RAM and that sort of thing. The demand for this laptop is pretty damn low. It can't run games. I'm running Dawn of War Soulstorm, which is a game from like the 2000s on lowest graphics. I can't run anything on this computer. It's very, very old. Nobody wants to buy my computer. So I can't really afford to charge $1,000 for it because the demand just isn't really there. But if we think of some super cool Alienware computer with like Core i7, really good RAM, graphics card, that sort of thing, well, the demand for that sort of thing is a bit higher. People actually want a really good, powerful computer they can run lots of games on and things like that. So the demand for this cool gaming computer is going to be higher, and therefore the price is going to be higher, and you can afford to charge people a little bit more for that sort of thing. So that's just one aspect of life we looked at, just looking at houses. But if we think about a large generation on the whole leaving the world, such as the baby boomers, and a smaller generation come into it, there should be on average less demand for most products. Now, there might be some cool fad that arises, say like some new item of technology that just the old people can't really understand, some cool new holograms. The demand could be much higher for that in, say, the millennial generation than the baby boomer generation, but on average, there's going to be less people, so there's going to be less demand for all products. So what you can expect to see is for the cost of living to essentially drop down, because if we, again, look at this supply and demand curve, we take the demand curve, we move it closer, move it down, we move it to the left, everything should get cheaper. What does this mean? Well, if everything gets cheaper, then people have more money to save, essentially. And if they don't waste it on everything, consumeristic hedonism, essentially, they can afford to spend this money on raising more children. Because that is an economic consideration. I imagine, it's not really a factor of my life at the moment, but I imagine there are people out there who would like to have a child or another child, but they simply can't afford it. You know, children aren't exactly bringing in the bills. They're kind of like a black hole of money in that regard. Not that I'm saying you shouldn't have children, or that you shouldn't love your children just because they're a financial burden. That's sort of the price you pay for them. But children aren't bringing home the bills. They are a financial drain. They cost a lot of money. You know, your nappies, your car seats, and that sort of thing. So what we could predict within a society is that you have a very large and populous generation like the baby boomers, and they have to compete with one another for the housing and things like that, which drives up costs massively. And these people cannot afford to have so many children because their demand for so many products has increased, therefore their price increases. So you go from the baby boomers to a much smaller generation. And this generation is, as I've mentioned, less demand for most products, if not all. Therefore, they're able to spend more money on their children, have more children, and therefore the next generation can be expected to be much larger. By and large, this cycle hasn't been allowed to simply occur in the West. We have massive immigration from the Third World propping up our workforce, and I'm not exactly 100% sure why. Maybe it's because no politician wants to be the politician who resides over a shrinking economy, a recession, so to speak. Because that could occur, you simply have less workers in a generation compared to the one before it. Well, your economy might backslide a little bit because there's simply not enough people in the economy to keep it going at that certain rate. I've seen some people reading that, or saying I should say, that it's about keeping the baby boomers happy, because what happens to the baby boomers if their value of their property decreases? Well, baby boomers generate a lot of money from property because they're going to attempt to pass it on to the next generation, and that's going to help fund their retirement. So what happens if the baby boomers can't sell their houses for as much as they'd like? Well, they're going to get very uppity at the government, and they might demand increased pensions and that sort of thing, despite having paid not as much into the system as they're taking out. I'm not 100% certain on the reason. It's probably multifaceted. We can think of propping up the prices of property, whilst also ensuring that migrants in the Third World, they vote overwhelmingly for the left. So it's establishing a guaranteed voter base for you and that sort of thing. Corporations love it because people in the Third World are happy to work for less, so you can generate more money to buy your 10th yacht. I don't really know. I doubt it's a single reason. It's probably multifaceted. There are many groups within the West with incentives to push mass immigration. They have a lot to gain from the system that we're currently operating under. What I'm hoping I'm showing you with this video is an antidote, a way out from the propaganda. It is nonsense to suggest that we need mass immigration from the Third World to prop up our population and to ensure the wholesomeness of our economy. It's simply not true. The free market is capable of accounting for these things. We take a large generation who compete very fiercely for resources. There's a high demand, which results in high prices. They can't afford to have as many kids. That smaller generation, it has less demand on resources, it has less competition. It can afford to have more children. But what occurs when you add in mass immigration from the Third World is that you artificially stimulate demand for resources within that society. If we think about a growing population, it has 18 years to account for the increased supply. You have 18 years to build more schools, more roads, that sort of thing. But what essentially occurs with mass immigration is that, as we've seen in Germany, 1 million people can cross your borders in 1 year. And how do you account for all that in such a short amount of time? How do you supply everything they need? Well, you don't really. You have to just take it on with fiat currency. So what we're going to see in Europe, or any country with mass immigration, is the population of the native population is not going to increase because there's that demand for resources pushing them into higher economic markets, I should say. The migrants coming in, often they won't be able to compete at that higher end. They'll be taking the cheaper housing, the lower paying jobs and that sort of thing, and that essentially puts more pressure on the native population. The native population now, it's harder for them to go out and get those shittier jobs, those shitty entry-level jobs, those not as good houses, those cheaper houses and that sort of thing. So they've got to buy up. What does this mean for the native population? Well, now the native population doesn't have as much savings, and they can't afford to have as many kids. It's a sort of eugenics. in this way. The meshing between economics and migration is a form of modern day eugenics. This is what we're seeing throughout the West. Birth rates of native populations are sinking. And that's also multifaceted. There's also this idea of the behavioral sink. When humans just have way too many resources, they lose sight of their survival instincts. But I wouldn't dismiss this simple supply and demand trick, which is that if you increase demand for resources, if you increase competition, everyone really wants that house, everyone really wants that car, well, people are willing to pay a little bit more for that thing in order to get it. So we have an increased cost of living, an increased cost of housing, a decreased amount of jobs available to everyone, and then you throw in the welfare state. Now what the welfare state does, on average, is through the threat of violence, we will lock you in a cage if you do not pay, sort of thing, is it takes resources from the native population and gives them, on average, to the incoming immigrant population from the third world. Well, that's further stripping the ability of the native population to have children and further increasing the ability of the incoming migrant population to have children. Make no mistake, reproduction is in part a game of mathematics. If you simply do not have the resources to support and sustain a child, you're not going to have one. Or you can, but that child's not going to survive and grow to maturity. So yeah, this is a massive issue. But a compounding factor is that some people are incredibly incentivized to keep this up. As I've mentioned, some people enjoy getting votes from third world migrants. Some corporatists enjoy paying for essentially slave labor from third world migrants. Some people enjoy making Facebook posts virtue signaling how much they love third world migrants. There are layers and layers and layers of incentives to importing people from the third world into the first world. What we need to do is get rid of these incentives. And how do we go about doing that? Well, I would say we need to end the welfare state. If we kill off a large part of the demand for coming to Western countries, that's obviously going to have an impact on supply. Not as many people are going to want to come to Western countries if they're forced to basically land on their feet, get a job, and work really hard. Something else to consider is ending or severely restricting migration from the third world. This would obviously decrease the supply of new people within the country and would have a proportional effect on the demands placed on the native population. If there's not enough people, there's more resources to go around, people can afford to have more children. Something else that absolutely must be done is restricting the size and power of the government. Having one group in charge of so much power is absolutely abhorrent and results in massive fluctuations within the market, as is the rule of economics. What we have is a group of people in charge solely of the borders, of education, to large extents of the economy. And what this essentially does is it allows them to peddle their incentives to people. Through the schools, they can tell everyone, in the case of Australia, that Australia is a multicultural nation and we value and accept diversity, and that sort of thing. Through their control of the borders, they can essentially throw them open and let people come in. Through their control of the economy, they can tax the native populations to ludicrous levels and redistribute the money to incoming migrants as they see fit. Businesses can also be forced to comply with increased regulations. Things such as raising the minimum wage, diversity hiring, and that sort of thing encourages the transfer of resources from native populations to incoming migrant populations. Those are essentially the three starter points that I would suggest. End the welfare state, slash immigration, and shrink the size and power of the state. Thanks all for sticking around for this one, guys. I do want to remind everyone that it is super important that as many people as possible join in this conversation we are having at this crucial time in the West. It is super easy to join the conversation. If you have a smartphone, you can join in the conversation. If you have a laptop, you can join into the conversation. You can be really fancy like me and buy a $25 microphone online, and then you're really in the conversation. But truly, it has never been so easy to fight the darkness. Anyone can join this conversation. This has never ever occurred in human history before. We can steer society in the way we want to. All it requires is that you just take that little plunge, put yourself out there. Maybe you get embarrassed, maybe you get a mean comment, but what is that compared to the cost of the enslavement that we face if we do nothing? Get involved, put yourself out there, and have some fun with it.